Okay, I think we might start now. So my name is Bernadette McSherry and I'm the Director of the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever we may be today, in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. The Melbourne Social Equity Institute is funded by the University of Melbourne to facilitate interdisciplinary research. The projects we support are aimed at reducing disadvantage and marginalisation. And we also have a particular focus on community-led, community-engaged and co-produced research. This webinar is part of a series exploring mental health and society. And the topic today is on welcoming diverse consumer and survivor views and voices into mental health. Now, I think this is particularly salient given the recent recommendations here from the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. And certainly the recommendations are aimed at ensuring system-wide involvement of people with lived experience of mental illness and psychological distress. The recommendations point to involvement through, for example, a new non-government agency led by people with lived experience, a new collaborative centre for mental health and wellbeing, and there's also specific leadership roles mentioned in a new mental health and wellbeing commission, the government's mental health and wellbeing division, and also regional boards, as well as mental health and wellbeing services. So there's plenty of opportunities that will be opening up for consumer and survivor voices. Now, I need to point out a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the Melbourne Social Equity Institute website after the event. If by chance you find that any of the subject matter is challenging, you can always leave and then perhaps have a look at the recording later on, should you wish to. We'll be using the Q&A function for questions, so please feel free to write any questions in that, and I'll come back a little bit later and perhaps read some of them out. And the chat function is also turned on, as some of you have discovered, so please feel free to chat and say hello to one another. Now, to introduce the star of this webinar, Indigo Daya is a consumer academic at the Centre for Mental Health Nursing here at the University of Melbourne, and she's also been a Melbourne Social Equity Institute Community Fellow. She has lived experience as a survivor of childhood trauma, and her research interests cover a wide field from human rights to MAD studies to consumer survivor perspectives in mental health contexts. It is wonderful to have her here with us today. So welcome, Indigo, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. It's wonderful to be here as well, and a big hello to everyone. I'm just going to share screen now. So we're hoping that works. Looks like it's working from my end. I'm here today to talk about welcoming diverse and challenging consumer survivor views, and we'll get into what that means as I talk a bit more. If you're not in contact with me outside of this space, my Twitter handle's down there. Please come and say hello over on Twitter. But before we get into any content for today, I'd also like to acknowledge the land that I'm on today and acknowledge that many of you may be on different lands around the country. So I'm here and want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of where I live and work, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Okay, I also felt that it was really important today to acknowledge the kind of context that we're in the world at the moment. And Bernadette and I were having a bit of a chat about this before. I was saying how hard it feels for me at the moment, just being aware of how many different experiences of human rights violations and inequities there are, and then realising, of course, that these have always been there, but what we're experiencing at the moment is more people speaking out, and more people speaking out more loudly. But nevertheless, I think it is a difficult time. It was, as I put this slide together, I got a bit tearful thinking about how many people are experiencing violations. And this is just a sampling of big challenges going on for many of us at the moment. And of course, something that we need to bear in mind with all of these issues is, of course, that they're intersectional. And so, yes, I'm here focusing today on issues in the mental health system and consumer survivor voices and human rights, which many people experience. But if you're an Aboriginal person in Victoria's mental health system, you're much more likely to experience violence and human rights violations. And if you're a person with a co-occurring disability, that's also the case. If you're a queer person, that's also the case. And so I'm hopeful that even though what I'm sharing today is particularly about the mental health system, that it might have some relevance to other spaces that intersect with this, or other spaces entirely. So welcome wherever it is that you're coming today. So I'm wanting to talk to you about a paper that was published last year. It doesn't feel like a year ago, but at pandemic time, I guess. And my co-authors on this were the wonderful Bridget Hamilton and Kath Roper. Bridget, I could see in the chat you're here with us today. And so you can find this paper online, and it's called Authentic Engagement, a conceptual model for welcoming diverse and challenging consumer and survivor views in mental health research, policy and practice. Just quite a long title, so sorry about that. And what I hope you get out of this is an introduction to the model that we wrote about in this paper, which gives you some practical ways of thinking about how to welcome diverse and challenging views, and what is it that we mean by that. I hope that this paper also helps us to move out of tokenistic practices, which are really common in consumer survivor engagement, and into a much more genuine, authentic space. I'm hopeful that this model really helps with embedding co-design and co-production processes, because if you don't get the people right, it doesn't really matter what you do with the processes from there. And I hope that it might also add another lens to thinking about diversity. And so there's some of the elements that might be useful today, I hope. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well, I know Bernadette did too, but I was supported to work on this paper through a community fellowship at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. And that is a wonderful program. I can't recommend it highly enough. So it seems to me that the more experiences we have of diversity, the more likely we are to experience human rights breaches. And this is no different for consumers and survivors in mental health services. And so some of the issues that we experience include detention, forced treatment with potentially very serious, even life-threatening adverse effects, solitary confinement, physical restraint, mechanical restraint with straps, chemical restraint, and sexual violence. These are not small things at all. These often have lifelong consequences for people, and they certainly, many of these have had lifelong traumatic consequences for me. And these are not also unique to mental health. We hear about these kinds of issues for many other people living with diversity, and some of the human rights impacts, but certainly not the only ones, are the right to equality before the law. So the fact that most of these, certainly not sexual violence, but most of these practices are enabled under mental health legislation. Many of us argue that that is discriminatory, particularly in relation to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. These also impact our right to liberty, to bodily integrity, and to freedom from torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. So this stuff, amongst others, is why this model matters, is why elevating the voices of consumers and survivors matter. I was encouraged when I've been reading, I won't say I've finished reading, but in reading the Royal Commission's final report into Victoria's mental health system, to read this quote that said that they envision a future where people with lived experience of mental illness or psychological distress are recognised as leaders and active partners in reforming the mental health and wellbeing system. This is a really important statement, and we'll go into that more, but to have this authorised in this way, I think will be a really important boost to move away from tokenism. We've not had this kind of commitment in the past. And there was another quote that I thought was worth including because it really links into the model in the paper that I'm talking about today. And so the report said that elevating the perspectives and expertise of some people while excluding others means that opportunities are missed to genuinely engage with different experiences and to foster appreciation of diversity. And this approach poses fundamental challenges. And this is a really important point because it's something we see happen a lot in the mental health sector when consumers are involved, is that some people get to speak and other people don't. So engaging with consumers and survivors is really common practice certainly in Victoria's mental health system. It's not a new thing from the Royal Commission, but the Royal Commission is suggesting that this has to be elevated in a number of different ways. But the ways in which we see this happen are consumer advisory committees, reference groups, project teams, consultations, engagements, committees, co-design, co-production, all of these kinds of spaces. But we don't always do it well. And I would argue that the majority of spaces I've been in haven't done it well. Often they do some parts well, but it's rare to actually find an engagement process that does all of the processes well. One of the pointers for me that I've experienced in some roles is when non-consumers, non-survivors will come up to me and go, "Hey, Indigo, what do consumers think about anything? What do consumers think about seclusion? What do consumers think about antipsychotics?" It always struck me as quite a strange question to come up and ask me. And no stranger than someone coming up to me and saying, you know, what do people who live in Victoria think about something? Of course, we think many different things. And when I was working in a public policy role at one point, I came up with this little poster, which you probably won't be able to read on this screen, but it's just indicative really. And when people ask me that question, Indigo, what do consumers think about something? I would pull this out and go, which consumers do you mean? And it would be helpful because people kind of stop and go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And that would slow us down and start to think a bit more intentionally about which people's voices need to be heard in this space. And often it wasn't me, it was about bringing in more voices that were relevant to the space. Engaging with consumers and survivors, there's often a struggle that people go through thinking about, well, who is it that we're supposed to bring in and how do we do it authentically? And how do we avoid tokenism? What does it look like when we're being tokenistic? Janet Ma, who's a long-standing consumer worker, was quoted in the Royal Commission report with this great quote saying, "Some of us are picked because we're tame and will go along with whatever is said and done. Others of us are picked to represent because we're known, and it's easier to pick us because we're a known element." And a common critique by many of us consumer survivors is that we are rarely actually representatives. That if we're employed by the system to do a role, we're not representing consumers. We're only representing consumers and survivors if consumers and survivors chose us to represent them. More realistically, what we're there for is to bring some expertise and knowledge. These are some other ways in which we might notice tokenism, and we're certainly not addressing all of these today, but things like having the same person, the same consumer that's always brought in regardless of the topic, a focus on choosing consumers and survivors who agree with current policy and practice, who don't bring critical views. encouraging people to come in to share their story rather than bringing in collective knowledge from the consumer survivor movement and workforce. Not even thinking about relevant lived experience. So there's been times I've been asked to join committees as the consumer representative to look at mental illness and homelessness. And of course, I decline opportunities like that because I've not experienced homelessness myself. And absolutely people who have that lived experience should be speaking to that. But also I'm not well engaged with lived experience literature in that space. And so it's really important to bring in relevant lived experience. Just because I'm a consumer and personally identify as a survivor doesn't mean I can speak to every issue that we collectively experience. Often there's only one of us. Often we're only brought in after all the big decisions have been made. And often we're brought into spaces that are called co-design, but actually they're just doing the same kind of consultation that's always happened. So some of the concepts in this model, and we'll start by thinking about some people's different experiences of treatment. And so it's really common to hear consumers and survivors speak about ECT. And for those outside of mental health, that's electroconvulsive therapy, or what we used to call shock treatment, and some people still call shock treatment. And this is my personal experience. And it was thinking about this that actually, helped me with the seeds for this model. Was when I was involved in policy conversations about electroconvulsive therapy and realizing that I have a very strong and clear view about this. I had 12 sessions of electroconvulsive therapy and they were not helpful and they were also harmful. And my perspective is that ECT was harmful. But I knew then as well that there are people who have a very different experience who will say ECT saved my life. And it's not appropriate or my place to privilege my view over other people's views, that if we're going to engage with consumers and survivors, we have to recognise that people have different experiences of treatment. When we speak about treatment, it includes a number of things. So diagnosis, the effects of medication and ECT, what kinds of treatment options and choices were available to us and that we accessed, and the kinds of outcomes that those treatments had in our lives. So looking quite specifically to our experiences of treatment is important. And these are some, this is a quote from a person called Karen, a consumer, who said, ECT was something I decided in partnership with my treating team. I had to trust them because I was desperate for relief and too unwell to be confident in my own treatment decisions. It wasn't barbaric or something that I didn't have a choice about. I feel thankful that when nothing else worked, it got me through. And so this is Karen's experience, and it's a real experience that's shared by many other people. But what we also need to remember is that there are people like this person, Matic, who said, I was transformed from a 28-year-old, happy, optimistic, musical woman to a person who could not think or feel. My capacity to be myself was severely diminished. Electroshock damaged my brain and made it very difficult to be a first-time mother to my newborn daughter. I do not remember holding her in my arms for the first time. We were separated until June. My heart was broken. And so this creates a challenge for us as consumer survivors who work as advocates, but also for people who want to engage with us. And let's think about another aspect of our experiences, which is not treatment, but care. So I find the word care really tricky because most of my experiences are not what I would call caring. It's always been difficult for me to realise that the word care is not the same as caring and is much more often about institutions. But let's think about some different experiences here. And so some people will talk about their experiences of mental health care as being frightening, of being hurt. And again, this is an experience I have. In my testimony to the Royal Commission, I spoke about, in one instance, my experience of seclusion or solitary confinement, and how absolutely not just terrifying, but shame-inducing that was. that at the time I felt like I didn't deserve to live, and then being secluded made me believe that even more. So it's a very frightening and hurtful experience. But there are other people. Oh my goodness, we've got a slide with a dodgy layout. I'm really sorry, everyone. My inner perfectionist is going right off at the moment, but we'll just ignore her for a bit. So some people will talk about feeling safe and respected, and without doubt, that is also a true experience for many people. So in the same system, we have some people being really scared and hurt, and some people feeling really safe and respected. When we talk about care, we're talking about things like staff attitudes and behaviours, facilities and rules. Many mental health services have many rules, human rights, whether people were safe or experienced violence, and the emotional impact of being at that service. And so this is a quote from Sandy Jeffs. And Sandy said, I always felt uncomfortable in these mixed wards, especially when I was locked in. On this admission, I was stalked by a male patient. He threatened me several times. I reported him, but the staff did nothing to make me feel safe. I'm not even sure if they believed me. And sexual harassment and sexual violence are common experiences for people in locked psychiatric services. And I'm sure everyone can imagine how frightening that experience would be. And here's a quote from someone who felt safe and respected. Nathan, my case manager and I built a good, trusting relationship. So I talked about experiencing sexual abuse when I was 6, which I'd never talked about before. It felt like a huge relief to get it off my chest and let someone know how it affected me. So Nathan had a really positive experience with the person he worked with, but it was very different to the experience that Sandy Jeff spoke about on the previous slide. So the question that a lot of people get stuck on when confronted with this stuff is like, who is right? Who is right here? Which is the correct experience? Which is the experience that should be invited into a project that's thinking about sexual safety in inpatient services, or a project that's looking at ECT and how people can give informed consent? And it's kind of a nonsensical question to ask, really. It depends on where you're standing and on what your experiences are. All of those people are right because all of their experiences are true. And this is the challenge that we've got to grapple with. People have different experiences of treatment and care in this big complex system. And so naturally, different experiences influence different views. So this conceptual model that we put together takes these two ideas and just puts them together into a matrix. So on one axis, we have negative and positive experiences of care. And on the other, we have positive and negative experiences of treatment. And so you can see here what we get is sort of 4 areas that cluster in this matrix. So people who had treatment, the treatment really helped. And the people were great. And we have other people who say, look, the treatment, you know, the medication or the ECT didn't help at all, or even it was awful. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm telling you the wrong way around. People say the treatment was really helpful, but the staff were terrible. My experience of getting the helpful treatment was bad. And the one I was first speaking about was down here. And then we have people like me who found the treatment didn't help and had a whole lot of negative adverse effects, and I wasn't treated well. And so it's helpful to split these out because very often, even if people think about the nuances or differences in consumer and survivor views, they tend to just think of positive and negative rather than splitting into treatment and care differences, because often these are really significant areas and they're important to getting reforms and service delivery right. And so here's some examples of what people might say in each of these different areas of the matrix. And so these diverse experiences often influence our preferences for language. So someone like me who's had negative care and treatment, I tend to describe myself as a psychiatric survivor. or as a survivor. And this is particularly helpful for me because my history is trauma, and that was what caused my distress. And so survivor sort of encapsulates all of those experiences. And I describe my experience as trauma or madness. And some people prefer the language of neurodiversity. There's a variety of choices here, but this kind of language tends to fit with people who've had wholly negative experiences. Whereas people who found that the treatment didn't help, but the staff were lovely, and they might say things like, you know, look, they really tried to help me, they listened, they gave me time, but it didn't help. I was still as distressed when I left as when I went in. These folks might tend to describe their experiences as still a little bit differently to the kind of language that the system might use, because the system wasn't able to help them with their experiences, but might tend and seem to have a preference for person first language, client or consumer. Whereas in the areas up the top, you can see we're tending to get people with preferences that are more in line with the kind of language that the system itself tends to use, which to me makes a lot of sense, that if you've had a really positive experience of a service, why would you be challenging or wanting to think about your experience in a different way? So diverse experiences also lead to different priorities about advocacy and change, the things that we care about and want to shift. And this was what I was particularly interested in looking for when I was reviewing when we were reviewing consumer narratives for this paper, was thinking about, do people who have different advocacy priorities tend to describe different experiences? And so far, but this requires more research, that was what we seem to be finding, that people with a wholly negative experience, which we called a kind of activist group, will tend to advocate for peer-run approaches outside the mental health system, for mad pride, and really focus on human rights. Folks, we call this group transformers, who've had negative treatment but positive care, will be more likely to want to work with the system because they've experienced nice people who want to help, but let's embed some different approaches to treatment within that system, like peer support, like trauma-informed practice, like recovery. People who've had helpful treatment but really hurtful care won't tend to talk about treatment at all, but will focus on the issues like inclusion, safety, respect, better facilities, addressing issues of around diversity and inclusion. And people who've had wholly positive experiences will tend to not advocate so much for change to the system, but advocate around access to the system. So we need to address stigma in society, and we need to have better pathways so that people can ask for help and get it. And we'll see those kinds of narratives. And so I'm noticing the time. I'm sort of speaking to Claire and Bernadette at the moment. I'm not too far off the end, but I'm just going to pick up the pace a bit. And so let's just move on from this slide. So this picture here is a kind of summary of all of the things I was just describing, that broadly, not entirely, because people are not as simple as fitting into 4 clusters, but if we think about diverse experiences leading to diverse views, and think about sort of 4 broad clusters of people who will have different sort of sets of language preferences, different advocacy priorities, different experiences that they want to speak about. And certainly this maps with my experiences over 15 years of doing advocacy work, that people tend to focus in different ways. I wanted to name as well with the model that I always feel very uncomfortable with a matrix with just 4 blocks in it, because the world is much more complex than this model suggests. And that, so this slide is really here to just to name intersectionality, to remember that there are many other aspects of diversity that have to be given voice and space for consumers and survivors, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But also that these experiences will also impact our experiences of treatment and care. These things aren't separate. And so in practice, to take the model into practice, it's asking us to think about diversity as being more than identity, culture, and demographics. And we have to think about those as well, always. But it's asking us to think about what kinds of experiences people had and make sure that that broad diversity is all in the room. It's asking us to engage with people who don't speak from all views, and to be aware of our biases and to not exclude views. And for me, this is the way that I use the model myself, is to remember sort of where I sit and what I have particular expertise in, and as a reminder about when I need to really make sure I'm listening to other people or opening the door to other voices. It also tells us that we have to engage with a lot more people than the system currently does. Having just one person is tokenistic and not terribly safe anyway. I've been on too many committees in my life as a consumer where I'm the only person in a room and there's 15, 20, even 30 other people who are all clinicians, policy people. And that's not okay. If we want to move forward and really welcome diversity, we need to be thinking about half the room having lived experience of the problem that we're there to talk about, not one or two. And that gives us lots of space then to really think about and welcome in diverse experiences. And it also speaks to us about seeking more complex and multiple solutions, to stop trying to say, what is the answer? What is the thing that we have to do that will meet people's needs, and understand that we need to stop producing a single thing, you know, that the answer is this, and that we have to instead create a buffet, much greater variety of choices that address people's different needs and experiences. And so that's my contact details. That's the details of the paper here, which I'm hoping some of you will read, particularly if I didn't make too much sense today. And I might hand back to you, Bernadette.
Thanks so much, Indigo. That has really given us a lot to think about in terms of, you know, what diversity actually means. And there's been a lot in the chat about how grateful people are to have that really clear graphic with the 4 dimensions. So I would encourage people to write any specific questions into the Q&A function, but if I might indulge myself and just ask for a question now. I was really taken by your mention of half the room, you know, having half the room of people with lived experience. And I know there is some research suggesting in relation to gender equity that you need at least 3 women on a board to make any sort of difference. If you have 1, it's tokenistic. If you have 2, then they might be set against each other. But at least if you have 3, you're making some headway. So I'm just wondering whether you've reflected about that, and, you know, this idea of a critical mass. Would you see it as at least 4 people representing each of those dimensions, plus added on in, you know, every single body, service, you know, anything that has something to do with the mental health system?
Yeah, look, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because so often I'm thinking, you know, good, better, best. Like, obviously anything more than 1 is better than what we've got at the moment. And sometimes even 1 is better, because the majority of the most important decision-making spaces, we're not in there at all still. I think half is a really good thing to aim for. I think if a project says that it's doing co-design or co-production and it's not half consumers, then it's not really co-design or co-production. So I'm willing to make that call. But I think in other spaces where it's consultation or engagement, yeah, what is a critical mass? I'm not sure. And maybe that's also something that needs to be engaged with on a project, you know, in a project, when you're thinking about that, to actually invite into some consumers to talk to you. Because for some projects, it might be more important to have a bigger group of consumers, because the power imbalances are so particularly strong that it's a really good way to counter it. And for others, it may not be so important.
Yeah, thanks for that. We've got some questions coming in now. So there's one from Magenta. I know it makes it messy, but did you consider putting in the system itself into the model? You can have nice people that is providing care that people rate highly, working in a system that doesn't meet the needs of people. for example, short durations of care, shunting people from one place to another, limited hours, and so on. So I'm wondering about a triple layer model of treatment, care, and system. Sounds interesting.
Oh, wow. No, I haven't thought about that, Magenta. I'd be interested to have a conversation with you about it separately, and so we should do that. I have thought many times, though, like I know reality is like a million times more complicated than that model, but I also know that models help us to think differently. And so my hope with this is that it at least might help us get out of the current thing of grab a consumer, without too much thought, stick them in a room and it's done. And it leads us to think more intentionally. But in no way is it as complex as reality. We probably need like a multi-dimensional dodecahedron to really capture it all.
Sounds good. We've got a question from Piers Gooding. Disagreement among consumer and survivors is sometimes portrayed as evidence of a fractured, disparate group of individuals who can't find agreement. Whereas disagreement within professional disciplines like law, psychiatry and psychology is often portrayed as a sign of a robust field of knowledge. So he then goes on to ask, do you see consumers and survivors working in mental health services as creating a new body of knowledge?
Wow, great points, Pierre. Yes, I've heard that kind of comment before as well. And like disagreement's really healthy, and I think I hope this model is helpful for us as consumer survivor workers as well as the system in thinking through these things. I'd be really interested in us finding ways to think about this in terms of like the ethics of our practice, because it's very easy to just share what each of us care about. But what was the question, Bernadette, from his?
The new body of knowledge.
Well, I think we've already created a new body of knowledge, and I think it's growing and it needs to grow much more. But there's a fairly substantial amount of papers that have been published by consumers and survivors around the world, but it is tiny in comparison to literature by the sector itself. And so I think we need a much bigger, more robust body of knowledge. And there's many reasons why that hasn't been there to date, and we need to create better pathways for us to do that and create more spaces we can get into the sector to produce that.
We have another question from Greta Baumgartel, who says that it's difficult to put this into a question form, but do you think this kind of model is applicable to carer and consumer representation in these areas, since as groups we already can't agree on how strong a combined alliance between these two groups should be? And of course, there's also lots of crossover. So it's really, does this model apply to carers and consumers together? Are there other layers, I think is what is being asked.
Yeah, gosh, that's interesting too. I wouldn't want to speak for how this might relate to carers. I've been a carer, but I don't work from carer perspective or sort of go into that space. And so I guess that the questions I'd be asking around that would be, what are the sort of, are there two pivotal sort of experiences that fit on an axis? I would suggest that that for carers, it might be helpful to not think about what the consumer's experience was of treatment and care, but think about, what are the two critical elements for carers' experiences. But certainly it will be interesting to think about.
Now, there's quite a few comments in the chat, but one I think I might pick up on is, do you think this might actually overcome the reluctance that seems to be in the system as it is to engage with consumers and survivors?
Oh, gosh, I don't know, Bernadette. If I knew the answer to that, I would have tried to find a way to do it already. I think we need many other things besides this. I hope this is one ingredient that helps, but it's not enough of an ingredient to make a fabulous Black Forest gatto. I don't know why that is my metaphor. I think I might be hungry. If there are some folks who just don't want to have us in the room because we're too challenging, and I've experienced that. I've had colleagues or been, part of groups where people just don't want critical views because they don't want to change. And so that's a challenge. I think we need a lot more attention on allyship as well. I think that's a really important space for people who are not us to understand how they can be allies and stand with us to make these changes. But I don't think on its own it's enough, but it's a part.
And following on, I think closely allied to that question is, what advice would you have for researchers who are interested in working on projects that, you know, look to mental health care, treatment, the system as such, who you know, want to engage with consumer survivors? What advice do you have?
Well, I would be, I'd encourage you to think about this model both in the consumer survivors who are involved as researchers or in an advisory role, but also in terms of participants in your research, to intentionally be thinking about those sort of positive and negative ends for treatment and for care, and understanding that one can be good without the other necessarily being good. So
sounds great. Now we're nearing the end of our time. So is there anything else that you would like to say, Indigo, before we start wrapping up?
Look, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming to listen today. I'm rather chuffed that you've all come along and were interested. That's great. I feel awful that I can't see you all. It's really sort of mysterious. I'm like, are people actually there? I'm not sure. But I guess what I'd say is, you know, if you've got any other questions, please do get in touch. I think, are we sharing the slides? I'm happy to share the slides if we can do that. And so my contact, you can just find me at Melbourne Uni anyway. So please do get in touch there or on Twitter. I'd love to yarn with people.
That would be great. And just also repeating that this is being recorded, so it will be up on our website. So you'll have another opportunity to look at those wonderful slides. I really wish, Indigo, you were doing slides for all academics. It was so amazingly clear and yeah, absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for such a wonderful, stimulating webinar. Really enjoyed it. And I'm sure you'll get a lot of people contacting you separately as well, and hopefully continuing the conversation. And just to point out to people, this series will continue. So next up, it'll be on the 6th of May at 1 p.m. And Magenta Simmons will be speaking about youth participation and partnerships in research. So I hope you can join us then. So thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.